I want to talk about family. Family is frequently identified as the most important thing in life.
But what's real is family.
The basis for a structured existence and a critical part of continuing the human species. But I don't want to discuss the family in terms of its abstract philosophical merits. I want to talk about the specific material ways in which family functions. Because of this, I can think of no better example to represent the mechanical and structural functions of the family than Paradox's Crusader Kings. Unlike my last video about Paradox games, my intent with this video is not to go over all the different ways that Crusader Kings gets things wrong, historically or politically. Whether or not Crusader Kings perfectly captures the finer details of medieval reality is mostly irrelevant to this discussion. I'm just going to be talking about the broad strokes. Because with the broad strokes of this medieval ruler simulator, Paradox has put the player into a situation that promotes and rewards a set of behaviors that I find really interesting regarding the family and property, which illustrate in detail the function of the family in relation to the modern private property system and capitalism. Additionally, though it may seem like a bit of a reach right at this moment, the expansion of options for non-straight sexualities in Crusader Kings 3 also helps to reveal the assimilationist processes that the dominant structures in the world use to co-opt and absorb variance and dissent. To start talking about the way that family works in Crusader Kings, we've got to ask, what is the goal of the game? Like basically all of Paradox's strategy games, some people totally do just play them to try to paint the map a certain color by expanding their borders, or to create counterfactual ethno-nationalist superpowers. But the mechanics in the Crusader Kings games in particular are much more focused on the basis of the monarchical power structures of ancient Europe, dynasties, or put another way, families. As Crusader Kings 3's Steam page states, guide a dynasty through the centuries, ensuring the security and power of each new generation. Gather new lands and titles to cement your legacy. The family-focused mechanics are what separates Crusader Kings from other similar games, and allows it to be about more than just the standard conquer and control. So let's talk about how this works in practice. In Crusader Kings, you play as individual rulers in an unbroken chain of inheritance. You'll play as King something, and then when King something dies, you play as his son, something 2, and then when he dies, his daughter, somethinga, and so on until the end of time. The player is free to pick any random count, or duke, or king, or emir, or jarl from any region from Ireland to India according to their personal preferences. The player's goal, generally, is to compete with their neighbors and expand their territory via warfare, subterfuge, clever marriages, and inheritances. As time progresses through this process of competition and centralization, the world of Crusader Kings then transforms from a patchwork of tiny baronies and counties into prototypes of the massive nation-states we know today. Like I said, the main thing that separates Crusader Kings from other similar games is its mechanics, which focus on the importance of family in the feudal medieval system. In Crusader Kings, the family and property are intrinsically linked by these mechanics. This is best exemplified by the 2 fail states in the game. First, if your family line ends, meaning you have no one of your bloodline that can inherit your properties, and so you lose. Second is if you run out of property, via either invasion, unlucky inheritance, etc. Both of these center the connection between family and property very distinctly, with both ways to lose boiling down to a family losing control of the property that they have historically claimed. In the world of Crusader Kings, a family without property cannot be selected to play as, and this is likely because, if you could do that, you'd have no meaningful way to influence the game's world, and it would be extremely boring. Within Crusader Kings, the family meaningfully exists and is worthy of representation within this setting only when it comes into control of some property, which in this case is territory on a map, by which it can vie for power against its neighbors. The mechanics of the family extend beyond just being an interface between the player and the territory they control. One of the other major ways that the family system functions in Crusader Kings is as a means of distributing property via inheritance. Inheritance in Crusader Kings is not a simple process of deciding which child gets what. The inheritance rules at the beginning of the game for most of the world are some sort of partition, wherein all the titles and property owned by someone are divided equally among their children following death. The problem with this, for the player, is that it means whenever they gain considerable territory, it all divides itself again upon death, making it very difficult for the player, who only gets to continue playing as one of those heirs, to maintain consistent control over a consistent set of territory. The other issue is that these small, divided territories are easy targets for invasions, and they won't necessarily come to each other's defense. This causes a constant vacillation of territory that prevents the formation of longer-term power blocks. The distributional function of the family in this case is intended to share wealth equally among all children, but this actively disrupts the goals of the player and of their AI competitors. As time progresses, the player unlocks the ability to shift the inheritance rules for their family to prevent partition, with options like primogeniture, where the oldest son takes all, typically being the most common option. This change towards centralization is key for the growth of modern-looking nations, while also ensuring the continuity of property ownership down the family tree. This causes the player to preferentially select inheritance rules that promote centralization to remain competitive, because as the player shifts their inheritance rules to allow for easier centralization, the AI families in the rest of the world do the same, further incentivizing buy-in to this centralizing process. This race to centralize is of course also a consequence of the intrinsic link between the player, family, and property that we just discussed. More territory, more centralized control over that territory, and consistency of that control are all mechanically incentivized by these activities, granting the player not only more ability to exert control over the game's world, but also a better chance of avoiding a game over. In the same way, these children, who act as vessels for the transfer of power and property, themselves become governed under a set of incentivized behaviors that cause them to be treated like the property of their parents. Children in Crusader Kings are the primary means by which property is transferred from generation to generation. This means there is a lot of pressure on the player to ensure that their character's children will be able to perform this function as effectively as possible. The player is afforded a wide variety of tools and options to help guide their children towards desirable behaviors and traits. The desirability of certain traits and behaviors can be directly mapped to how they will affect the ability of the player's children to carry out the player's goals. Usually, this means children who are in line for inheritance will be groomed for high competency in warfare, diplomacy, and stewardship, while children further down or outside the direct line of inheritance are then typically intended to be used as pawns for marriage, so traits that make them likable and not too ambitious are preferred. These are only the least invasive and violent ways that children are targeted by this system. Within this framework, where children are intended to perform a specific function within the family, suitability for either rulership or marriage becomes the standard by which all children are judged. Children with disabilities, with sexualities that must be kept hidden, those accustomed to foreign cultures or religions, will make stewardship of property more difficult, and therefore these children are more likely to be removed from the line of inheritance by either legal or violent means. This can mean anything from sending children off to join a monastery, conveniently removing them from the line of inheritance within certain religions, to intentionally sending them off to war and hoping the odds won't be in their favor. If it sounds like children are being referred to here more as things or tools meant to accomplish some goal, that's because that's exactly how the player in Crusader Kings is incentivized to think about them. It's not a stretch to say that within this family structure, children not only function to distribute property, but are also effectively treated as property themselves, to be disposed of and controlled however their parent chooses. This mechanical incentivization to have children conform to a set of rules that make them either more effective as the stewards of property or as tokens for trade and marriage also has wider-reaching effects outside the direct family. The same mechanics that make characters more or less likable to one another, and that incentivize the cultural, religious, sexual, and ableist standards of each family, also apply outside the family. In Crusader Kings, people prefer people who are like them, either culturally, religiously, or in terms of their character traits. The player and the AI in Crusader Kings are both rewarded if they enforce conformity upon the kingdoms they rule, the people that work closely with them, and upon their neighbors. The enforcement of conformity in this case extends from the same origins as it does within the family: the motivation to ensure compatibility for marriage or for rulership between all parties involved. The family in Crusader Kings 3 exists not just as a self-policing system, wherein conformity arises as a result of natural pressures of incentivization within the game's mechanics, but also as an externally policing system, wherein the state apparatus that the player controls also acts to externally enforce the royal family's rules of conformity as much as possible. So far, we've been talking about Crusader Kings in terms of the mechanics and ideas that make up the game, instead of speaking in terms of the real history that these games are meant to recreate. I have a good reason for that. For one, they're close enough for our purposes to outline the overall historical process by which the family became the partner of property. For two, Crusader Kings, like many similar grand strategy games, isn't really about literal history. The basis of the game's world may be derived from some historical reality, but as soon as things start moving, it usually diverges from historical reality quite rapidly. For these reasons, I'm not using Crusader Kings to illustrate a specific example of some concrete historical reality, but as an example of a set of mechanical processes that recreate a very specific form of the family. Crusader Kings places this version of the family, with its intrinsic connection to property, in the distant past of the medieval era. But if we examine these behaviors, mechanics, and pressures that surround the family in Crusader Kings, we find that the world of self-interested families vying for scraps of territory isn't an exclusively medieval phenomenon. I think that this fact can be made obvious if we look at the different ways that Crusader Kings 3's mechanics for the family reflect elements of the modern nuclear family. The family of Crusader Kings is set in a state of permanent competition with all other families, who compete for the same limited property resources, since a lack of property results in a loss of access to political or economic power. The family of today similarly exists in an enforced state of competition, with access to resources controlled under the inherently competitive rules of capitalism. This competition then necessarily leads the family to be incentivized to accumulate as effectively as possible, and this, consequently, centralizes wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands. The family then also serves as a site in which conformity is established and enforced, both internally with family members and externally in society at large. All of these things should be understood not necessarily as dysfunctions of the family system, but instead as unchanged aspects of a system that intentionally reduces human kinship to a vessel for the accumulation of wealth and power. These elements of the family in Crusader Kings complement the competitive feudal mechanics of that setting, and in reality today, these elements of the nuclear family complement capitalism and the paradigm of private property. But some of you might be asking, isn't the institution of the family less relevant now than ever? Wasn't Karl Marx right almost 2 centuries ago when he wrote, "On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeoisie." Yes, the family is less relevant now than it was when Marx wrote that, or 1,000 years before that when the feudal family was the center of all power. It's true that among most of us, among the poor, the family does not usually operate in a way that exactly conforms to the strict structure that I've been describing. Some aspects, like enforcement of conformity, remain more prevalent than others. But by and large, the nuclear family, which corresponds to the mechanics of the feudal family in Crusader Kings, is now more prevalent as a cultural ideal than as a concrete reality. But with the family as an institution losing prevalence, why do we not see capitalism and private property dissolving alongside the structure that once proved so critical to their dominance? This is because the ideological foundations that the nuclear family system is based on have been embedded deep within our collective cultural consciousness, as the cultural institution that we know as straightness. Straightness and cis-heteronormativity, as they exist in popular society, come pre-packaged with a number of deeply harmful assumptions that parallel the basic mechanics of the nuclear family. These foundations, these basic assumptions about inherent human behavior, have served to naturalize a set of behaviors which capitalism requires. The biological need to procreate, to make a family, to provide property and its benefits for that family, and to privilege the success of blood relatives over the needs of any others, are the prerequisites for justifying the belief that humans are naturally competitive, greedy, and hateful or fearful of difference and change. In the context of Crusader kings, these behaviors are used to the benefit of the player. But in real life, there is no player. There is no guiding, conscious, intergenerational force whose survival is fundamentally tied to the continuation of a family tree. The function that the player serves is mirrored in reality by the set of dogmatic misunderstandings of survival of the fittest that I've just described. The valuing of property over human life is similarly justified in part by these same assumptions, and the harm caused by this is especially apparent today. The privileging of these family relations justifies a slew of unique property relations, like inheritance, shared family ownership, and the sharing of access to medical care, things that are permitted to exist for essentially no other relationship in society, regardless of the actual kinship people feel with one another. These beliefs construct and support a so-called natural order, where hierarchy, inequality, and hatred of the other are inescapable realities. After all, if we're all just in this life to pair up, procreate, and pass on our genes and resources to our offspring, then there can be no real structures of cooperation or solidarity in society, only structures that allow the best competitors to survive. But of course, this incredibly hetero way of thinking about life is also beginning to fall out of favor. People are beginning to realize that blood relations are not the be-all end-all, and that passing on their genes isn't an inherently meaningful exercise. One of the groups leading this paradigm shift is, of course, queer people, for whom blood relations and procreation often don't or can't align with how we live our lives. Due to this, one might assume that queer people are inherently incompatible with the propertarian mindset that the nuclear family and straightness are built upon. One could then further extrapolate that a world which is slowly becoming more and more queer and accepting of queerness would also then naturally move further and further from the competitive, centralizing, and normalizing system of private property that we currently live under. By this logic, a majority queer world would necessarily mean the abolition of capitalism and private property. I know this is something that very few people would seriously argue for, and I'm not trying to make a straw man here. I'm asking you to consider this extreme scenario as we return to our examination of Crusader kings, because in Crusader Kings 3, the scenario I just described, where a majority of the people in the world fall under the queer umbrella, is actually just something you can do. There's a button. Everyone's gay. Here, we can model how the scenario of a majority queer world could have exactly zero impact on the basic rules of property and capitalism. The button that turns everyone gay is a new thing in the Crusader Kings series, only appearing in the newest entry, Crusader Kings 3. In previous games, same-sex attracted characters did appear, but being gay was just a random character trait that was not super impactful beyond a penalty to opposite-sex relationships and fertility. Crusader Kings 3 expands on this by also allowing for bisexual and asexual characters, though by default, these are also still just random traits and only really come up when someone is trying to find secrets to hold over someone else's head. In terms of representation, it's whatever. I guess it's realistic for the time period, and that's fun for some people, so that's fine. The really interesting part about these expanded options for queer characters is the aforementioned ability to make everyone gay. This is configured when you start a new game. There's just an option that determines the most common sexuality, with the default as straight, and the other options being gay, ace, bi, or an equal mix of all four. Coming into the game for the first time with this option, you might think this kind of change would have some really big impacts on the world. For example, how would the feudal family system function if most people were in relationships that did not produce offspring? The answer to this question that Crusader Kings provides also happens to answer the question I asked earlier, of how a majority queer world could still end up reproducing the systems of private property and capitalism. This answer revolves around the family, because Crusader Kings 3 makes a choice that I think makes a lot of sense from a game designer's perspective. They make the family structure, when the world is predominantly gay or bi or asexual, still exactly the same as when basically everyone is straight. Even with the most extreme and ahistorical revisions to religious law that the game allows, which can decriminalize same-sex relations, same-sex marriage is never permitted. What this means is that even with same-sex attraction being the norm, everyone is still forced into straight marriages that are intended to produce children to serve as heirs and allow the property family structure to continue functioning in the same way, with the aim of accumulating wealth and power across generations. At first, maybe this sounds like the issue here is just the lack of gay marriage. But my point here is that even if Crusader Kings 3 did allow for gay marriage in the game, with some sort of adoption or surrogacy system to allow for heirs, this would still mean the direct continuation of the property family paradigm. Because as I've described it, the property relation-centered function of the family does not necessarily exclude gay, bi, ace, or even trans people if adopted children can inherit. But I would be lying if I said that just throwing in gay marriage and adoption would resolve my issues with how the family exists in Crusader Kings, and what that says about the real world. Because in my view, incompatibility between queerness and the private property-centered family is kind of the point. A point which Crusader Kings is fundamentally incapable of dealing with because property and family cannot function independently within its mechanics. Therefore, the form of queerness that appears in Crusader Kings 3 is one that has been assimilated into the structure of the family and private property in a way that intentionally negates any meaningful opposition queerness has historically had to these institutions. There's a long history of queer people writing, marching, and fighting against the institutions of capitalism, the family, and the places where those two systems intersect. The way that Crusader Kings 3 has chosen to represent queerness closely reflects current trends within capitalism and capitalist-mediated culture that attempt to assimilate queerness in the same way. As an example, let's think back a little over a decade ago to the campaign for marriage equality. I don't think very many people would argue that the material benefits that follow from being able to get married aren't a net positive for queer people. But what many have argued is that the way that we are now required to comply with the dominant political and economic systems in order to access these material benefits have led us towards the path of assimilation. To quote Ryan Conrad's Gay Marriage and Queer Love, "Equality rhetoric is short-sighted at best, and positions our most fantastic queer futures as not only unattainable, but also unreasonable. It demands that we put our time and energy into the desperate fight to be equal participants in oppressive and archaic institutions, instead of attempting to actualize our dreams of queer utopia. Furthermore, equality rhetoric has created a vacuum of gay pragmatism in which our queer political imagination has withered away, allowing no time or space to even imagine more just, more equitable ways of meeting our material and effective needs as a larger community. By buying into the institution of marriage as a legitimate form of government oversight over who gets to create kinship and how they get to do so, we have also tacitly bought into the same ideological system that justifies the private property-centered family. The natural competition between families for limited resources and the consequent pressure to accumulate relies on limited, state-mediated avenues of kinship. Families with same-sex spouses still experience the cultural pressure to conform in all other ways to fit into the same mold as straight families. Queer people of all kinds are pressured to find ways to fit themselves into the spaces adjacent to straightness, while ensuring that straight comfort and normality are continuously centered and respected. Assimilation always requires the destruction of some part of the assimilated, as they make themselves acceptable. Whatever acceptable amount of queerness is permitted must be compatible with capitalism and the private property system. That's not a coincidence. It's the intentional outcome of assimilation. Handing out breadcrumbs of state sanction can also be used to divide the community and destroy our solidarity. This, too, is entirely consistent with the goals of the state and capitalism. The goal of capitalist assimilation of queerness is to find out what our price is for buying into the system, and then to string us along with concessions that ultimately result in our equality, insofar as we are willing to participate in this inherently unequal system. Queerness is allowed to remain slightly aesthetically different from straightness, but in terms of the underlying mechanics of how we interact with the systems of capitalism and private property, it must be exactly the same. Much like in Crusader King's scenario of a majority queer world, we would find queerness becoming just a different kind of straightness, with no material opposition to the system of capitalism and private property. Material opposition to this system is so critical for marginalized and queer people, because in the end, the best we can ever hope for by playing along with these systems is to, in a way, become the oppressor. The idea that we could reform the family and the dominating triumvirate of the state, straightness, and private property just by swapping out the participants, and that this would somehow alleviate the harm that these systems inflict, is a fantasy. However, this fantasy meshes so well with the dominant capitalist culture that we already see it embraced and reinforced back to us in advertising, film, and politics. What I hope to have proven to you here is that the negative outcomes we see today are the inherent consequences of these systems functioning as intended, and that replacing individual parts of the machine won't change the overall function it is designed to produce: domination, accumulation, hierarchy, and violence. Since the current form of the family is so deeply entangled with the institution of private property and capitalism, material opposition to this configuration must take the form of family abolition. Similarly, because straightness carries the ideological seeds that allow family and private property to grow together, abolition of that system is necessary as well. Right-wingers have frequently intentionally misunderstood calls to abolish the family, or abolish straightness, as the government taking over the function of the family, or heterosexuality being banned by the state. But these complaints reveal more about the current methods of oppression that society directs towards those that don't conform, much more than they resemble the actual goals of abolitionists. Under the current regimes, the family is already heavily policed by the state, forced to conform to prescribed expectations and to jump through legal hoops to gain state sanction. Sexualities outside of straightness have been subject to violent state control in a majority of the world up until very recently, with a long way to go in a lot of places. The fears expressed by conservatives here are basically that we might do to them what they have always done to us, when in reality, these things should have never happened to anyone. I've talked a lot about why the current realities of the family and straightness are harmful and in need of revolutionary abolition. One of the most commonly deployed arguments against abolitionists of all types is to demand we answer with extreme specificity what would replace the current structures. Sophie Lewis's recent book, Full Surrogacy Now, is a great place to start for a socialist discussion of family abolition, and I would strongly recommend it. In Full Surrogacy Now, she names several already existing examples that might inform what the post-family, post-straight world might look like. Queer found families could serve as an example of kinship that ignores the traditional biological connection. Community parenting, the understanding that it might literally take a village to raise a child, could inform a future where children are not merely the property of their parents. But people that ask for an in-depth explanation of what the post-family world might look like will rarely accept the logical answer: that any generalized program or broad plan of action an individual might dream up would be necessarily incomplete, as it would be lacking, by definition, the input of those communities that would implement it. Any explanation of what would replace the family and straightness must also include a discussion of the restructuring of the whole of society, because the family and straightness, and the assumptions that flow from them, are so deeply ingrained in the function of capitalism and the state. Abolition of the family and straightness must therefore occur in step with other revolutionary changes to government and economy. I could get into a giant discussion here of what my preferred forms of social organization would look like in a post-family, post-straight world, but I've already done a video about that, and honestly, that's not so much the point. What I hope to have made clear here is that the current structures of the family and straightness are deeply broken, and so entangled with one another and with capitalism and the state that we could never hope to cleanly remove any single part of the machine in an attempt to repair it. Our current predicament, with the death cult of property and profit leading us to a climate collapse, has only been possible by the way of the justifications inherent in the family and straightness. A better future can only arise by reversing the destructive tactics that the family and straightness use. Competition replaced by cooperation, accumulation replaced by distribution, and enforcement of conformity replaced by individual autonomy. Crusader Kings 3 is, of course, not a game about family abolition or queer liberation, and it never pretends to be. But in its representation of the family, there are the unmistakable mechanisms of the property family-oriented worldview that dominates the world today. In its representation of a possible queer world, it reveals the methods by which queerness can be made acceptable to capitalism and feudalism, and ultimately can be defanged of its radical historical dimensions. By representing in detail the mechanics of the family that were important to the rulers of the distant past, Crusader Kings highlights how these same mechanics continue to serve our rulers today.